If your doctor has recently mentioned that your blood pressure numbers are running high, or if you're already taking something for it and you found yourself wondering whether there's more you could be doing beyond the tablets, then stick with me for the next few minutes because I want to share something that hardly anyone brings up when this diagnosis is first given. There's a body of solid clinical trial evidence showing that certain lifestyle changes can lower your blood pressure by amounts that match, and in several cases actually exceed, what many of the standard medications achieve. I'm not talking about vague wellness advice here. I'm talking about specific, measured outcomes from real trials compared directly against the average effect of the drugs themselves. Now I'll say this up front. These comparisons come from separate studies conducted on separate groups of people, so they aren't perfect apples-to-apples trials where one group took a pill and another changed their habits under identical conditions. Still, taken together, they paint a remarkably consistent picture of just how powerful these non-drug approaches really are. My name is Dr. Wilson, and I spent close to 10 years working emergency medicine in busy hospital departments, where the downstream damage caused by unmanaged blood pressure shows up constantly: heart attacks, strokes, heart failure admissions, kidney deterioration. High blood pressure rarely announces itself. It sits quietly in the background until it causes a catastrophic event, and that silence is precisely what makes it so dangerous. What frustrates me most, having watched this play out again and again, is how much of the underlying risk is actually within a person's control. So if any part of today's discussion helps you take back some of that control, then it's been worth making. Let's set the stage properly. Roughly 1 in 3 adults lives with hypertension, and it earns the nickname the silent killer because the overwhelming majority feel absolutely nothing unusual. No headaches, no dizziness, no obvious warning signs, unless the numbers climb to genuinely extreme levels, upward of 180 or 200. Even then, plenty of people report feeling perfectly fine while their arteries are quietly being damaged, their heart is working harder than it should, and their odds of stroke and heart attack are steadily climbing. Most guidelines now aim for a reading under roughly 130/80, and ideally even lower than that. When changes in daily habits aren't enough on their own, medication becomes genuinely important, and it does save lives, no question. But here's the number I want you to keep in your head throughout this entire discussion. The average blood pressure medication brings down that top number, the systolic reading, by somewhere between 8 and 12 points. Hold on to that range because we'll be measuring everything else against it. Let's start with the ACE inhibitor family, medications like ramipril and lisinopril, among the most frequently prescribed blood pressure drugs anywhere. They work by interrupting a hormonal pathway that normally causes blood vessels to constrict, allowing those vessels to relax and pressure to fall. A large pooled analysis of multiple trials found this class produces an average reduction of about 8 points over 5, with little meaningful difference between individual drugs in the group. Compare that to what happened in a landmark randomized trial testing a whole food dietary pattern, rich in fruit, vegetables, low-fat dairy, whole grains and nuts, and modest in saturated fat and red meat. Among participants who already had elevated blood pressure, that dietary pattern alone produced a drop of roughly 11 points over 5.5, without any specific sodium restriction and without deliberate weight loss, just the eating pattern by itself. That outperforms the average ACE inhibitor, with none of the dry, persistent cough that affects a meaningful share of people taking these drugs. The key word is consistency. This isn't about tossing an extra vegetable onto your plate occasionally. It's about genuinely restructuring how you eat day after day. Next, amlodipine, another one of the most widely prescribed blood pressure tablets, belonging to the calcium channel blocker family. It works by relaxing the walls of blood vessels so they're less tightly constricted, easing the pressure inside them. Independent analysis puts its average effect at around 12 points over 7, one of the stronger results among commonly prescribed drugs, which explains why it's used so often. The lifestyle equivalent here is regular aerobic activity, brisk walking, cycling, swimming. Multiple large reviews looking specifically at people with hypertension who engage in consistent aerobic exercise report systolic reductions in the range of 7 to 12 points, with some studies landing right at the top of that range among people who reach roughly 150 minutes of moderate activity weekly. Other reviews report reductions between 6 and 12 points. At its upper limit, that matches amlodipine directly. And we're not talking about training for a marathon, just meeting activity targets most people are already aware they should be hitting 20 to 30 minutes most days. Amlodipine is generally well tolerated, though it commonly causes ankle swelling and sometimes flushing or headaches. Regular aerobic movement causes none of that, while also improving fitness, mood, metabolic health, and overall cardiovascular risk in ways a pill simply cannot replicate. Now, consider losartan and candesartan, both angiotensin receptor blockers, working through a mechanism closely related to ACE inhibitors but without triggering that same cough. Pooled data places this class at roughly 8 points over 5 as well. Here I want to focus on weight loss, because the numbers are genuinely striking. Research indicates blood pressure tends to fall by approximately 1 point for every kilogram of weight lost in people who are carrying excess weight. That might sound modest until you do the arithmetic. Losing 8 to 10 kilograms, entirely realistic with sustained dietary change, translates to an 8 to 10 point drop in systolic pressure, matching or beating the average ARB. And weight loss doesn't work through a single narrow mechanism the way a drug does. It reduces circulating blood volume, improves insulin sensitivity, and dampens activity in the very hormonal system that ARBs are designed to block. It's addressing the underlying biology rather than intercepting one downstream signal. Indapamide, a thiazide-like diuretic, works by prompting the kidneys to excrete more sodium and water, reducing circulating fluid volume and bringing pressure down as a result. The evidence places this drug at roughly 9 points over 4. The comparable lifestyle factor here is sodium intake. A well-known controlled feeding trial compared a high-sodium diet against a genuinely low-sodium one in people who already had hypertension, and found that cutting sodium from high to low produced a systolic reduction of around 11.5 points compared with the high-sodium group, a number that surpasses indapamide entirely. Not a drug, not a supplement, simply reducing sodium intake. Most people get the bulk of their sodium not from the salt shaker at home, but from heavily processed foods. So in practical terms, this usually comes down to cutting back on ultra-processed items as much as realistically possible. Bisoprolol, a beta blocker, works differently from everything mentioned so far. Rather than acting on blood vessels or the kidneys, it slows the heart rate and reduces the force of each contraction, which lowers pressure as a result. Evidence puts its average effect around 10 points over 8. The lifestyle counterpart here is resistance training, a dedicated analysis pooling randomized trials of strength training in people with hypertension or borderline hypertension found an overall reduction of about 8 points over 4, but crucially, in those with established hypertension specifically, the systolic reduction reached 10 points, matching bisoprolol precisely. And the benefits extend well beyond blood pressure, preserving muscle mass, improving insulin sensitivity, reducing visceral fat, and supporting long-term functional independence, particularly valuable as we age. Beta blockers can cause fatigue, cold hands and feet, reduced exercise tolerance, and occasionally low mood. Resistance training tends to move every one of those in the opposite direction. Finally, spironolactone, an aldosterone-blocking medication that stops a hormone from signaling the kidneys to retain sodium and water. Once that signal is blocked, fluid volume drops and pressure follows. It's typically reserved as a fourth-line option, added when someone is already on several medications and their pressure remains stubbornly uncontrolled, meaning the people taking it usually have genuinely difficult cases. Evidence places its effect at around 9 to 10 points. Now step back for a moment, because each of these lifestyle interventions has been considered individually so far: the dietary pattern alone, weight loss alone, aerobic exercise alone, resistance training alone. Each one, on its own, rivals or beats a medication. But combine them, and something remarkable happens. One well-known trial, funded through public health research and published in a major internal medicine journal, took people who were overweight with elevated blood pressure and put them through exactly that combination: structured healthy eating, regular aerobic exercise, and a supported weight management program, sustained over 16 weeks. The result was a reduction of roughly 16 points over 10, 16 off the top number, 10 off the bottom. Sit with that for a second, because that outcome doesn't just beat spironolactone, it exceeds what most people achieve taking 2 blood pressure medications simultaneously. No prescription, no cost, no side effects, and this wasn't an extreme or unusual protocol, just a structured eating pattern, consistent movement, and supported weight loss. 3 things we already know individually shift blood pressure meaningfully, stacked together to produce results most people would assume required medication. And speaking of spironolactone, it carries a serious side effect profile of its own. It can push potassium to dangerous levels, disrupt hormonal balance, and in some men cause breast tissue growth, which is why it demands regular blood monitoring. Dangerously elevated potassium from this exact medication has, in my own clinical experience, contributed to cardiac emergencies. The combined lifestyle approach carries none of those risks, though it does demand something different: sustained commitment, consistent dietary discipline, and ongoing effort. For some, that will be genuinely difficult, but the underlying physiology is not in question. So what does that leave us? Across 6 of the most commonly prescribed categories of blood pressure medication, there exists a specific, evidence-backed lifestyle intervention capable of matching or exceeding its effect. Structured healthy eating rivaling ACE inhibitors. Regular aerobic activity matching amlodipine. Weight loss matching or beating ARBs. Sodium reduction outperforming indapamide. Resistance training matching bisoprolol. And a combined program outperforming 2 medications taken together. These aren't small, casual adjustments. A slightly better dinner here or an occasional walk there won't produce numbers like these. What's required is structured, deliberate, sustained change, but it remains entirely achievable for the overwhelming majority of people. Here's the deeper point worth sitting with. A blood pressure tablet does exactly one thing. It lowers your blood pressure reading. That's the entire mechanism. It doesn't touch your insulin sensitivity, your visceral fat, the strength of your heart muscle, your sleep quality, your mood, or your broader metabolic health. Genuine lifestyle change moves all of those factors simultaneously. And because insulin resistance, visceral fat, poor cardiovascular fitness, and chronic inflammation are each independent risk factors for heart disease in their own right, lifestyle change is addressing root causes rather than simply masking a number on a monitor. It carries no side effects and costs nothing. And improving your blood pressure through these means is, by definition, improving your cardiovascular health across the board and extending how long and how well you live. None of this is an argument against medication. For people with significantly elevated readings, those who've already experienced a cardiovascular event, or those genuinely unable to make sustained lifestyle changes, medication remains essential and continues to save lives every single day. The greatest benefit almost always comes from combining both approaches rather than choosing one over the other. What deserves challenging is the idea that a prescription marks the end of the conversation, that a diagnosis followed by a tablet means the job is finished. The evidence tells a different story. What you eat, how consistently you move, and how much excess weight you're carrying can shift your blood pressure by amounts many of us were taught only a medication could achieve.